Tuesday.
You have got to promise not to say anything, all right?
True colours will be revealed.
Whoa!
And her target
I want to kill you. Ow!
is going to suffer.
Oh, I'm really scared. It's not a normal person we're dealing with here. She's a nutter. She can rot, for all I care.
Coronation Street, Tuesday, TV1.
One of the reasons we never really fitted in is because we weren't obsessed with this chasing a peach bladder around the muddy field in winter. But not all of us were stuck in the classroom. I played cricket. F grade, but I played cricket.
Sport in the British and the New Zealand identity is very important. It's very important indeed. And if the Chinese don't play team sports, that's weird, you know? It's weird. How can you not play cricket and rugby?
Tana Umanga has, as far as I know, he has some Chinese ancestry.
Tana?
Look at those chinky eyes.
Yes, they're slanty.
And you can't grow a beard, man. It's just like really patchy. You see those big pictures of him, it's like, oh, that is such a Chinese beard.
Oh man, it's just slapped my mouth.
He's Pat Lam's cousin. I mean, how Samoan a name do you think Lam is, really?
Welcome, Tana, welcome. Just embrace it. If there were some Chinese in the All Blacks, maybe things would be better.
Just over a century ago, Wellington was home to a bustling Chinatown. But in September 1905, it became home to one of New Zealand's most awful hate crimes. In protest at Chinese migration, Englishman Lionel Terry entered Hastings Street with the express intention of shooting the first Chinaman that he saw. His victim was crippled ex-miner Joe Kum Yong.
After the murder, he went back to his club, went out for dinner with a group that included a couple of parliamentarians, acted as if nothing had happened.
And to make things worse, he became a folk hero for his brave act. The end of Joe's life was tragic, but so was his story. Joe was a man broken by the gold rush, a long-term sojourner who failed in his attempt to strike it rich, never made it home to his wife and family.
You know, the lowest point for the Chinese was at the highest point that New Zealand was coming to terms with who we were as a people, a loyal part of the British Empire and as being racially pure. 1905, the All Black tour to England, we lost one game. And what they learnt from that tour was that here in New Zealand, the Anglo-Saxon race was the purest and the strongest. And therefore, we definitely had to keep out these people who might pollute, you know, the race and bring it down.
The premier at that time was our dear friend Dick Seddon. And I'm saying that ironically because he was no friend of the Chinese.
Richard Seddon once said, "There is about as much distinction between a European and a Chinaman as that between a Chinaman and a monkey."
Bands of citizens formed racist leagues to lobby government, and government responded with more anti-Chinese legislation. Harshest of all was the poll tax of 1881, £10, and when that didn't stem the flow, it was raised in 1896 to £100.
It's only for Chinese. No other group, not even Indians because they were British, no other group had to pay this tax.
Many of them didn't get enough money to buy the passage back to China or to repay the debt and so on. Many of them were left in New Zealand destitute and old and led very sad, solitary lives, actually.
In 2002, the government recognised the hardship this caused.
Today, we also express our sorrow and regret that such practices were once considered appropriate.
People who say, well, apologies are a waste of time because it wasn't you who did it and it wasn't the people you're apologising to who suffered it. But, you know, the good thing about an apology is it's symbolic.
The Chinese were considered heathens. They talk in a different language. They are so strange. They are effeminate, gamblers, polygamous, opium smokers, inscrutable. They carry disease. They are a visible minority, even now.
Now, I'm not racist, but those MSG-guzzling third-world refugee visitors are stealing our jobs and homes.
I was the only Chinese person at school, and I didn't really think about that, but clearly everybody else at school did, and I got called a lot of names and got teased, and it all came to a head when someone was calling me names and a boy pushed me over and he broke my arm.
I started off hanging out with the Pākehā kids and found I couldn't stomach the racism and ended up dropping out of that social network and hanging out with all the bungas out the back.
You always felt that you weren't quite as good, or, you know, because you were Chinese?
I call myself a Chinese New Zealander, but I go down the street, people still ask me to go home.
One that gets me is like, oh, your English is really good. I don't feel it's something I need to explain to people, you know?
People still ask me, where do you come from? And I said, oh, I came from Remuera. And they say, oh, where do you really come from?
You can take that as being, I perceive you as the other, justify yourself. Or it could be an open inquiry. Because, you know, these Kiwis are such nice people. Yeah. They want to know. It's just that because we always have to explain it, it just gets kind of tiring. And you sometimes wish people would shut up and leave you alone.
I speak really good English. I feel like saying, you know, got a degree in English. I can probably speak better English than you.
They beeped at me as I was crossing the road and said to me that they use people like me as target practice.
My surname, Hu, you can imagine the knock-knock jokes that happen there.
After all these years that we've been here, people are still wary of us and see us as different.
I use the analogy of a person walking into a party when people already are talking to each other. So you see, I mean, in New Zealand, the Pākehās are talking to each other, the Maori talking to each other, and Maori negotiating with Pākehā anyway. And the newcomers came in, not knowing what was what and who is what and so on, and then feeling totally out of place. And people turn to them and say, why don't you integrate?
So, did the Chinese community accept the racism? Did they just shut up and put up?
The Chinese just kept their heads down, steadily working, trying to survive. Nobody said anything or raised any protest.
But there were really good reasons for that, I think. And that is because they've had to manage the stigma of being a so-called model minority to impress the Pākehā system. The new immigrant Asians are certainly a lot more vocal, a lot more brash, a lot more not afraid to rock the boat. And you know, they're demanding to know whose boat is it anyway.
They haven't got 100 years of legacy of racism to undermine their sense of worth. They just come in not toning down the Chineseness at all, which sort of freaked people out a little bit of the first. Like, no, the way you are Chinese here is not by being that. You know, the way you are Chinese is by being quiet about it. You're going to ruin things with your brash Chineseness.
And ironically, the old Chinese New Zealanders, some of those people are the first to vote for Winston Peters and say, close the gates now. All they need to do really is look in the mirror and remember where they come from.
But the new migrants too adopted a somewhat arrogant attitude towards the old migrants and regarded them as somehow less Chinese, less true Chinese, which is probably true, and that's just life. And I think it's kind of ironic for the new migrants to take this attitude because by the very fact of their being here and coming here, they've begun that process themselves.
When I moved to Auckland, I suddenly went from being practically the only Chinese person in my class to one of hundreds. In the 10 years between 1991 and 2001, the New Zealand Chinese population went from 40,000 to over 100,000, with 3/4 mainly in Auckland. While most of New Zealand embraced this changing demographic, xenophobia again reared its ugly head, with some screaming Asian invasion.
Long-term social disunity and economic disaster.
New Zealand should be for New Zealanders. We're not an Asian nation.
That is bound to fail because it hasn't worked anywhere else.
The time has come to cut immigration to the bone. Please don't expect the New Zealand taxpayer to fund your culture.
Yeah, I've heard all the jokes about Queen Street being like another Chinatown and visitors who arrive wondering if they're in the right country. What does that say about New Zealand?
We are not part of Asia.
We don't want them to take over the country, do we? You know, because they have a lot of children.
If they want to go around looking different, acting different, being different, they'll be treated different.
The host community's mindset will just have to adjust a little bit because it's just the reality of the world.
Demographics is a great thing. One can't close one's eyes to the fact that New Zealand is changing in colour.
You can't have a white New Zealand anymore. You can't have a white anything.
And then there were the settlers that were like my family, who came over in the 1970s during the professional labour shortage. And they call the kids of these immigrants 1.5s.
I've got a lot of flack. Like even since school, I perceived there to be a significant amount of racism at school, and I'd kind of make a bit of a fuss about it and call up Talk Back and things like that and name my school, and I got, you know, people mad at me, and perhaps because I just had too many superhero and mythological role models as a child, I just kind of really like to fight evil in all its forms.